I'm struck as I sit and I see the list get put up. And in the last session, when I heard some of the guys talking about what they're doing, and I hear the simplicity of we just need to let go of control and things. And it all sounds so simple. Like it just seems like it ought to be more simple. We've heard the term simple church, micro church, and you look at this list here, and here's what I think as I'm sitting. In 1900, the average age of a person who was born was 50. Today, the average age, they're projecting the average age of kids that are born today will live to 100. In just over 100 years, this nation has advanced technology in a way that the average life expectancy of a person has doubled from 50 to 100. And you look at this kind of list, and you say, we're a nation that put the first man on the moon, all the firsts we did, and we look at this list and say, how in the world can we be talking about this list? Like, why can't we overcome this list? And it's already been said, but the answer is we can't. Even though we've got the greatest thing in the world, it's God that can overcome the list. But what I want to press into tonight is the idea that, yes, we've got to cooperate with God, the Henry Blackaby part. Yes, we've got to pray and fast, but there's still a bunch of baggage that gets in our way. There's still an operating system in our churches that if we don't put to death elements of that operating system, we're fighting against a pretty strong headwind in it. And we at least have to be sensitive to do our part in the cooperating with God when we hear Him. So I get the challenge of Josh gets to inspire you, and I get to be the bad guy to sort of, give us the realism of where we are, and then Josh and Paul will help us move it forward again. So here's where I want to start. I'm gonna talk to us about the idea of operating systems, and I want to suggest to you that for those that are pastors or ministry leaders, I want to suggest to you that you don't normally think in terms of operating systems. You think about models, and there's a big difference between a model and an operating system. And we're going to talk about that. So just as we go through this, be thinking in your mind the difference. And here's where I want to start. Just 15 years ago, I would be in rooms like this training church planners, and there might be 50 church planners in the room. And I would say to them, let me see a show of hands, who's read The Purpose-Driven Church? And virtually every hand in the room would go up. When I'm in groups of megachurch pastors and I ask, how did you get your church started? Do you know that over 50% of megachurches in America right now were founded by the lead pastor that's there right now on the purpose-driven model? Over 50% of megachurches were built on the purpose-driven model. Just 15 years ago, 50 hands out of 50 would go up, I've read The Purpose-Driven Church. If I'm in a room of 50 church planners today, and I say, how many of you have read the Purpose-Driven Church? Guess how many hands go up? Almost none. And my answer to them is, don't worry about it. You don't need to read it, because the operating system you are inheriting in your church already has it. It's already there. You don't need it. And here's where the prayer and fasting part fits in. When we plant churches today, where do we start? We don't start with the prayer and fasting piece. We start with an inherited model. We don't even go back to the operating system. We start with a model. We take the model. So what I'm going to try to do here over the next 20 minutes is I want to dissect the operating system itself that gives us what we've gotten right now. And then the challenge is, how do we take the operating system and look at how it gives us the simple models with prayer and fasting, with the different things, so we can see where the gap is kind of diagnostically. Does that make sense? So here's where there should be a picture on the wall. I wish it was better, but I want to just introduce the idea of, think your computer system at home, whether it's your laptop, your desktop, even your iPhone, all right? The first thing we look at is there are components. There's keyboards, there's mice, there's all the different parts of the computer, printers. If we do the analogy to church, Those are all the physical, tangible resources we see in church. Buildings, staff, programs, Sunday services, all of the things we have at our disposal to accomplish whatever we're going to do are like the components in a computer. And whether we've got a Windows-based computer or a whatever it might be, it's just interchangeable components that the physical things look the same. If you jump from hardware to software, the software are the applications and programs that we use. And what connects them together is this idea of an operating system. And the operating system sits inside the computer. You probably use the Apple operating system or the Windows operating system. And think about, in my life, I have tried to switch from Apple to Android 3 times. I literally buy an Android phone, and I have it for about a week, and I give up and go back to the Apple phone. Not because Apple's better, but because going from one operating system to another is revolutionary change. It's not evolutionary. It's revolutionary, and I don't have the patience for the change. Well, the operating system sits inside a black box that you never see it. You don't get to see how it's controlling both the components and the software. And here's what happens, that the current operating system, I'm going to call it the consumer-driven operating system, the purpose-driven operating system. Underneath it are a bunch of things that are controlling how things are working. And I want to just walk through a narrative with you of dissecting the current operating system of how it's giving us what it's giving us. So I'm going to do this. We can go to the first dilemma. I've been part of an initiative for about the last 14 months, 40 different networks and denominations who are, the problem statement we started working on was this. We are in church today spending more effort to get less results, and we don't like the product we're getting. More effort, less results, and we don't like the product. And if I can just say an oh, by the way, with an asterisk, the product we don't like that we're getting is by and large, the current consumer-driven operating system is giving us cultural Christians. That's what it means by not liking the outcome of what's being given. And so this group of 40 networks and denominations has spent about 14 months not wanting to reinvent anything, not wanting to discover something that the first century church didn't have, but wanting to look and say, what do we need to do? What do we got to do, honestly, to fix these kinds of things that are on the whiteboard? So over the course of the last year, I'm an engineer. If you go back to whatever elementary grade it was that we dissected frogs, why did we dissect frogs? And the answer is their systems were simple. You could get inside and see the gastro system, the heart, the different things. And that's what I'm going to walk you through in a narrative right now, is 8 different dilemmas that when you start unpacking the current operating system, it'll explain how we've gotten what we've gotten right now. And here's the significance. If we want to get a different outcome, we have to answer the questions differently than how we're answering them in the current operating system. So let me start with number 1. I call it the legacy dilemma, rethinking our end game. Some of these things have been touched on already. So if I said to you, your church is going to have 30 years to make an impact, 30 years and it's probably going to die. In the history of Christianity, that's how it works. You got 30 years, no more. What's your end game? How are you measuring success after 30 years? What's the way you're going to measure legacy? Here's what the answer is in the current operating system, in the consumer-driven system. The answer is we want to grow a large, sustainable church. It's not the kingdom orientation that Josh is talking about. It's not gospel saturation in my zip code. It's not reducing lostness in my zip code. It functionally, the end game of the average church in America right now is we want a large, sustaining church, maybe multi-site even. And that end game, where does it take us in 30 years if it's not about the transformation or the saturation? And just go with me on this. If the end game is growing a large, sustainable church rather than the impact of gospel saturation, it leads to dilemma 2, and that's the mission dilemma. What is it we're actually doing? What are we trying to accomplish? If the end game is growing a large church, how do we get there? What's the functional mission? Not the aspirational mission, but the functional mission. And here's where we start to go off track in a big way. I'm going to suggest to you that functionally in the consumer-driven model that most of us are in, the mission is actually conversion. It's measured by a line in the sand of getting somebody baptized. Because if you can get them converted, it contributes to the end game of growing a large church. The mission's not functionally disciple making in its more holistic pattern. It is, let's get them to the finish line of conversion. And now let me suggest if the finish line of our mission is conversion, it leads to the third problem, which is actually the customer dilemma. And as soon as you start talking customer, you talk consumer. And now let me link it back to our current model of the purpose-driven church. Really at the core of our problem in the purpose-driven church is Saddleback Sam and Samantha. Saddleback Sam and Samantha are 35 years old. They have 2.5 kids. They have 2 cars with 100 and whatever thousand in debt. They're college educated with student loans. When they show up at church on Sunday morning, they need somebody to direct them in the parking lot. They want coffee that's better than what they get at home. And they better be treated well with high production, high quality when they get in. That we are trying to reach a consumer for what purpose? To get them converted as a consumer. It's just like in the business world, we need to get them. Let me share the little secret with you. Peter Drucker, the father of modern management, I think the best book he did, The 5 Most Important Questions You'll Ever Ask Your Organization, was the title of the book. And question number 1, who's your customer? What do they value? How are you going to deliver it? Who's your customer? What do they value? How are you going to deliver it? Guess who mentored Rick Warren? Peter Drucker. Guess what the purpose-driven church is? Go back and read it again. Rick Warren took the 5 questions from Peter Drucker's business theory and put it into church. Who's the customer? Saddleback Sam and Sally. What do they value? Great coffee on Sunday morning, high quality definition stuff, better than what they're going to get on their TV at home. The whole Sunday show is what the competition with it. And how are you going to deliver it? It's how we get to 80% of our budget, 80% of our time, talent goes to a Sunday production. It's all driven by the consumer-driven model that puts Sunday-centric things in place. That leads us then to a fourth, which is the programming dilemma. We talked in the last session that how you add makes all the difference. And part of why we don't have a disciple-making culture generally in the U.S. church is that we're programmatically adding instead of disciple-making adding. And so if we follow this logic, we're trying to grow a large, sustainable church. Our mission becomes conversion. To get conversion numbers, we've got to hit the Saddleback Sam and Sally, and we've got to deliver it in a way we can get them converted. Then functionally, how do we do it? Programming. We've got to have the corporate programming to what's that mean? We better have really good world-class kid programming when they show up on Sunday. We better have the good Sunday thing going on. It brings the programming dimension into play as our primary growth engine. As soon as we're focused on that, now I'm going to say this, I like to say this one's kind of the kiss of death. Somebody brought up the mobilization piece a little bit ago. I call this one the 3% dilemma. There's 168 hours in a week, and we're contending in the current consumer-driven operating system for 5 of those hours, and we're losing ground on 5 of the hours. We're not building an Acts 2 fellowship of believers 168 hours a week. We're contending for 3% of people's, for the consumer's time. These cultural Christian consumers that we make out of programs, we're contending for 3% of their time, instead of it being a family of lifestyle thing. That leads to the volunteer paradigm. Instead of mobilizing everyday missionaries to the mission fields where they are as a go and be, the volunteer paradigm here is, do you know that the U.S. church today, if you added up all the volunteer hours of the U.S. church today on a given Sunday, and then you looked collectively at the volunteer hours of the next top 10 volunteer organizations in the United States, that the U.S. church is the largest volunteer mobilization army in the history of the world. By far, the volunteer hours that we're mobilizing. Now here's the deal. For what purpose are we mobilizing volunteers? Go back to dilemma number 4. What are volunteers? The fuel of programs. We are not mobilizing volunteers to take new ground in gospel. Go back to the end game. If our end game was gospel saturation and reducing lostness in our communities, it would not lead us to a problem of having a volunteer paradigm and fighting for 3% of things. That leads us to the all-star dilemma, which is now somebody brought in the laity divide that we have. So now the 3% or the all-star paradigm is we've got to rethink how we're doing leadership, that who's qualified to really lead church. And this is where, when we get into the micro church, the simple church, on one end of the spectrum, are we going to require 6 years of education to be able to lead something, or where's the line of things? But as soon as we've got to mobilize an army of volunteers, we've got to have, I shouldn't say we have to, we allow the system then to have paid full-time staff. For what purpose? To coordinate the army of volunteers, because we've got to coordinate all the volunteers. So we've got to have the all-stars to do it. That then, I'm going to say, you've always got to look for what's the elephant in the room. I want to suggest that behind almost all the stuff we're talking about is the economic dilemma. If I could only change personally one thing in the U.S. church, I would change the economic engine. Right now, tithes and offerings fuels the economic engine, which isn't bad, but it's so inseparably tied from the growth of growing a large church. Here's how it would work. If you tell me where you want to plant a church in the United States, urban, suburban, and where you want to do it, and what size you'd like to be when you launch, I'll tell you how much money you have to spend. Or if you tell me a mega church, at what size they are and where they're located, I'll tell you how many staff they have, and I'll tell you roughly what their budget is. We have in the U.S. church what's called a non-liberated financial engine. Our growth is inseparably tied to the money, and that's the elephant in the room, that we're tied to the money, okay? If you jump over to everywhere you see disciple-making movements happening, you have liberated financial engines, meaning the number of people being reached is not directly proportional to how much money you're spending. And this whole thing then will trace back to the program. What do you need for programs? Buildings. What are the biggest debt or the biggest financial liabilities we have in the budget? Staff and buildings. That's the second elephant in the room. It starts with money. The second elephant is staff and buildings. Why staff and buildings? Because they drive the budget, and the budget is inseparable from our growth model. All of this just intertwines in a way that this is why we can't ignore the operating system part. We have put an operating system in place that all these dilemmas are intertwining in a way that we can idealistically say, not idealistic, we need to let go of the control that Josh is talking about, but the operating system is so ornery that we can't just say we're going to let go of it. These are not impossible problems to solve. They're not. But we have an operating system that is so pushing the way it is that it's hard to let go of these things with the operating. Now here's the final and eighth dilemma, and it really should be the first dilemma. The eighth dilemma is what I'd call the listening dilemma, or rethinking our discernment posture. And this is where the prayer and fasting piece fits in. Let me go back to the church planting side of things. We're piloting an operating system in these 40 networks and denominations right now. We have 15 church planters that are starting to work through. They're doing a 1-year piloting. And as I'm going to show you the operating system part in a minute, the first element of the operating system is prayer and fasting. It is a listening posture. And so here's all we're doing. It's 1 year. We've split the journey into 3 phases. The first phase, 3 months, is prayer and fasting to listen. Don't just inherit the operating system or motto you're doing. Pray and fast for 3 years to try it, or 3 years, that would be even better, but 3 months to try to discern what is happening and what God wants you to do, and then get into the discerning a plan and what you're going to do. It is driving most of these planters crazy, 3 months of prayer and fasting. Most of them don't know how to do it. We are so pragmatic in the U.S., we inherit the model from somebody else, and we just jump right to the action part without wanting the listening part. And so I would suggest to you that the reason we have the first 7 dilemmas is that we haven't put the 8th one first. Is that making sense? So I'm going to jump into the actual work we've done on this operating system thing. I want to be really clear. We can't open up the Bible and go to the chapter that's got the operating system, okay? So the work that this group's been doing is not to try to legalistically think. We've trying to do it more like an anthropologist would do, of studying people and studying things to look at it. I'm even going to suggest to you, when we talk about Jesus-style disciple making, or we talk about Jesus modeled something. So there is a model that Jesus has shown us, and I still want to suggest to you that undergirding the model is an operating system, and they're separable. There's a set of questions that if you're asking the right questions and you answer the questions a certain way, it will give you Jesus' model. But if you answer the questions of that operating system a different way, it might give you the consumer-driven model, a house church model, a multi-site model. There's an operating system that, depending on how you answer questions, will give you different models. So let me walk you through that as we're ending here. We've identified roughly 6 elements that each have questions that you need to ask to point you toward the model that you're going to do. The first element is this listening posture, and the key question we're asking is, how do we discern God's will for what we're launching? And in the prevailing model, let's just call it the consumer-driven model that most of us are in, the answer to that question is we ask God to bless our vision and our strategy. In a multiplication operating system, or a DMM, we ask God to reveal His vision and strategy through a foundation of extraordinary prayer and fasting. You've heard it multiple times already, but we've got to get that back as the first element. As somebody who champions church planting, my life is church planting, and I'm telling you, this is broken in the church planting world. This is not the normative thing in church planting. We inherit, and then we wonder why we're not getting the results that we discern. We've got to get this back as the first part of it before we get into anything else. The second question for the operating system, just imagine there's 2 or 3 questions on each of these elements. But the second main area is this idea of end game. What is our end game? How are we measuring success? If the reality is that our church probably isn't going to be around more than 75 years from now, but let's just say 30 to 75 years. If reality is that, what does it look like to break the paradigm that instead of us trying to perpetuate the institution more than that, we're embracing the fact that it has a life, and we're going to do everything we can in that 30 to 75 years that we've got. So the question of end game is looking 10 to 30 years in the future. When our church ceases to exist, what's our picture of success? In the current consumer-driven model, the answer is a large multi-location church. In a multiplication operating system, it's gospel saturation or reduction of lostness in an area. It's something more than just a single large church. This is where we go from the little C church to the big C church. Is our end game really to be a small part of the bigger picture of the big C church, or are we seeing our thing as the mini kingdom that we're doing? That's the end game question. The engine for growth is the next element. What's the primary driver of our numerical growth? If you were in the first session, this is the programmatic issue. This is the magnet on the 5 levels. In the prevailing model, it's corporate conversions fueled by Sunday-centric programs, supervised and coordinated by paid staff and run by volunteers. That's the engine for growth. Let me say it again. Corporate conversion fueled by Sunday-centric programs, supervised and coordinated by paid staff and run by volunteers. In a multiplication operating system, we have everyday missionaries mobilized where they work, live, and play to relationally and intentionally make disciples who make disciples. It's flipping the equation upside down. This is the shift from Home Depot used to have the mantra, you can do it, we can help. Our consumer-driven model is we can do it, you can help. But we've got to get it back to flipping it the other way. That instead of a volunteer, what do we say to a volunteer? You can help us do our programmatic thing, but we've got to be positioned to be saying, wait a minute, God does have a unique calling on your life where you work, live, and play, and ultimately it's for the purpose of disciple making where you work, live, and play. Now, how do we equip and mobilize you to do that in your mission field is what this one's about. The next question is the economic question. What is the economic model for our work? In the current prevailing model, it's tithes and offerings, non-liberated. In the multiplication operating system, it's a liberated economic engine with money being out of the way. That doesn't mean tithes and offerings aren't part of it, but it means that I've got to tell you, in the church planting world right now, I couldn't be more excited about what's starting to happen in this area. I just was talking just this past week with two people planting a church. They called me. It was the typical call I get. They wanted to talk about planting a church. And I thought when they wanted to talk about it, it was going to lead to money, that they were going to want to know how could I connect them somewhere where they could get money to plant their church. And we're 10 minutes into the conversation and they're not talking about the money yet. And finally I said, what do you guys need? And they said, we have a heart for reaching our community. We don't know what we're doing. We need help. And so I had to I'm like, well, what about, are you looking for money? And they're like, oh no, one of the guys is a pastor. The other's a business leader. He's 30 years old. He's started and sold 2 companies. And his third company is a digital marketing company. And he says, oh, my digital marketing company, when he told me how much money it's making after several months, he's like, he said, we've got a model that the lead pastor can be bivocational and work 15 hours a week in what I'm doing to pay his whole salary. And he's going to be able to work as a full-time pastor launching the new church using the business for mission model that we're doing right now. The business for mission models that are starting to unfold right now, and I'm going to go back to the question you asked about church planting. Why do we need the new church plants? Innovation and new things with the younger generation and what we're seeing, this issue of liberating the financial engine, it's coming. It's coming. And it's going to be partly through a business for mission kind of approach to things. But we've got to deal with the economic question. I'm going to say ecclesiology if you think about an operating system now, we're all the way down the list. And I want to suggest to you all the way down to before I say ecclesiology of what's church. This system works for non-church things. You could be talking about something else other than the church. We have to, in our operating system, have the church question in. What distinguishes church? Has to be a question so I'm going to pose it this way. We're headed a direction right now where I'm going to suggest ecclesiology is going to matter because increasingly, the example I use is we're going to have somebody who drives a shuttle bus from the airport to the rental car place as their occupation, declaring themselves the chaplain of the shuttle bus, and my church is the shuttle bus. Now, how are we going to respond to that? Like literally, how do we respond to that? And I want to suggest, let's go crazy in the positive way, in this way. That is the coolest missionary with a mission field ever. If we could get everybody in our church seeing themselves as an everyday missionary and their mission field is their shuttle bus, man, pour the gas on it. But as soon as you call it a church, we better be really careful. There's a 5-minute interaction, and here's how I come at it. I don't want to stand before Jesus someday and have him say, well, I believe he wants there to be a healthy family called the church for every man, woman, and child, a healthy, functioning family called the church. So I don't want to stand before him someday and have him say, why in the world did you set the bar so high on that people didn't get to experience it? But I also don't want him to look me in the eyes and say, why in the world didn't you take more seriously healthy family? The Acts 2 model, the idea of a healthy family, why did you set the bar so low? And as soon as we say that somebody driving the shuttle bus from the airport to the thing is a church, we've just cut out the idea of the Acts 2 church part of it when somebody's got a 5-minute interaction. But you know what? It's a great way to praise what's happening in that relationship as a missionary with a mission field. We have to change our thinking in that. Instead of that being a bad thing, how do we turn it into a good thing? But we still got to have this ecclesiology question there. And then finally, the energy. What gives power to the operating system? In the current prevailing model, it's attendance growth. It's this interplay between attendance growth and the finances, and that back and forth play between the two that gives energy to things. And I'm going to suggest that in a multiplication operating system, it's an Acts 2 fellowship of believers that are living in common that gives the and on mission to make disciples.